Oh man, you need to leave now. That's what the guard snapped before grabbing the old man's arm. He didn't fight back, just clutched the photo tighter and whispered, "I was invited." The lobby laughed. No one noticed his army boots. No one looked twice at the patch on his jacket until the rumble began outside engines, dozens of them. And when the doors flew open, a full military convoy was waiting. A uniformed colonel walked in, pointed and said, "If you believe some heroes speak loudest in silence, comment on or below." Calvin Brooks, 78, had traveled 2 hours by bus to attend a community ceremony honoring veterans at the newly renovated Summit Memorial Hall. He received a mailed invitation months ago, envelope slightly worn now from being read and reread, signed personally by the mayor's office. It was the first time in 15 years he'd attended any public ceremony. After Vietnam, he'd preferred quiet remembrance to parades. He wore his best boots polished to a mirror shine at 5 a.m. That morning, a crisp blue jacket with his unit patch carefully sewn back on after decades in a drawer, and carried a laminated fading photo of his fallen squad members. 7 mentally he had returned. The bus had arrived early, leaving Calvin waiting in the building's marble lobby, sitting quietly on a bench, never asking for help despite the ache in his knees from the long ride. He simply watched people file in, younger veterans in crisp uniforms, politicians in expensive suits, families dressed in their Sunday best. A young security guard, Kevin, noticed him while checking names against the digital guest list on his tablet. He scanned Calvin's worn jacket, his weathered face, the scuffed duffel bag at his feet containing a change of shoes in case of rain. "This area is for invited guests only," Kevin called out, tone suggesting he'd already dealt with too many disruptions today. Calvin reached for the envelope he'd kept in his jacket pocket, but his hands trembled slightly, the result of age and the medication that kept his heart beating steadily. "No ID, no entry," the guard insisted, now joined by a second guard, Marcus, who moved directly to Calvin's side, gripping his arm firmly. "Come on, sir, let's not make a scene." A few guests nearby looked briefly at the commotion but said nothing. One woman in pearls even chuckled, whispering something to her husband about proper attire requirements. "Come on, you don't have time for this. You're holding up real attendees," Marcus muttered, pulling Calvin toward the exit. "Big day, important people coming. You understand?" Calvin tried to explain, his voice soft but clear. "I have an invitation, the mayor's office sent it." He reached again for his pocket. "Sure they did," Kevin replied with an eye roll, "and I'm the Secretary of Defense. Look, there's a homeless shelter 3 blocks south. They're serving lunch soon." Calvin's shoulders straightened slowly, an instinctive response from decades of military bearing. "I'm not homeless. I own my home. I paid it off 30 years ago." "This isn't your place anymore, old man," Marcus said coldly, shoving the glass door open. "Try again when you're dressed for the occasion." Calvin looked in on his polished boots at the jacket that had taken him an hour to press properly with his old iron. His voice remained steady but dropped even lower. "I was invited because I once wore a uniform too. Nobody listened. Nobody ever did anymore." Outside, the wind picked up. Gray clouds threatened rain, appropriate for Calvin's darkening mood. He stood quietly under the building's entrance, awning clutching the photo of his old unit. Murphy Rodriguez, Kellen Washington, Chen Peterson, Baker, all gone now, their faces eternally young in the photograph, while his had aged into obscurity. Inside the ceremony, preparations continued. Staff tested microphones, caterers arranged trays of finger foods, a string quartet tuned their instruments. Through the glass doors, Calvin could see a banner being unfurled, "Honoring Our Heroes, Riverside Memorial Building Dedication." He hadn't come for the ceremony, not really. He'd come because the building was being renamed after the 17th Airborne Brigade. His unit, the men in his photo, his brothers, but someone had seen him. A young woman, Natalie Harper, an assistant at City Hall, had been checking names against the master guest list when she spotted the guards escorting Calvin out. Something about his dignified silence caught her attention. She checked the printed list and her eyes widened in recognition. "Wait," she whispered to herself. "That's First Sergeant Calvin Brooks." She looked again at the photo on her tablet, a military archive image attached to the invitation list. Same eyes, 50 years older but unmistakable. Natalie ran to her supervisor, clipboard clutched to her chest. "Mark, we have a problem. They just kicked out Sergeant Brooks." Mark barely looked up from his phone. "Who?" "Calvin Brooks. He's not just invited. He's the reason this building is being named after the 17th. He's the last surviving member of that squad. The event coordinator overhearing shrugged dismissively. It's too late now. The ceremony's starting in 20 minutes. The mayor's already mic'd up, but he's on the VIP list, Natalie insisted, pointing to his name. Then he should have dressed appropriately and arrived with the other dignitaries. Mark replied, we can mail him an apology letter tomorrow. Natalie stood frozen, conflicted between protocol and what she knew was right. Her grandfather had served in Vietnam, had taught her that some things mattered more than rules. She didn't listen to her supervisor. Stepping into an empty hallway, she pulled out her phone and made one call to a number her grandfather had given her years ago, saying it was only for real emergencies. Colonel Reeves's office. A crisp voice answered, my name is Natalie Harper, from Riverside City Hall. I think you need to know what just happened to Calvin Brooks. Less than 45 minutes later, the street outside the memorial building rumbled with the sound of approaching vehicles. A military convoy, 3 black SUVs with government plates followed by 2 Humvees, stopped in precise formation in front of the building. No sirens, no unnecessary show, just deliberate, coordinated movement. Doors opened simultaneously, boots hit pavement with synchronized purpose. Inside, the ceremony was just beginning. The mayor approached the podium, unaware of what was unfolding outside. A colonel in full dress uniform, medals gleaming under the entrance lights, strode into the lobby. Behind him, 6 soldiers in formal attire formed a perfect line. No one spoke, none needed to. Their presence commanded immediate attention. The colonel scanned the lobby, eyes settling on the 2 guards who had removed Calvin. They were sipping coffee by the security desk, laughing about something on a phone screen. His voice, when it came, carried the quiet authority that needs no amplification. Where is First Sergeant Calvin Brooks? The guards looked up, confusion replacing amusement. The colonel's gaze hardened. The man you escorted out, Vietnam veteran, blue jacket with the 17th Airborne patch. Kevin, the younger guard, pointed vaguely toward the entrance. The old guy, he's out somewhere, didn't have proper credentials. Without another word, the colonel turned and walked outside, his men following in formation. They found Calvin still standing quietly near the sidewalk, photo in hand, dignity intact despite the rejection. The colonel stopped 3 paces from Calvin, assessed him for one silent moment, then rendered a perfect salute. First Sergeant Brooks, the 17th sends its respects. Calvin's weathered hand rose to return the salute, muscle memory overriding arthritis. The colonel turned, gesturing for his men to flank Calvin, then walked back toward the entrance where a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion. The guards stepped forward, confusion evident. Sir, this man doesn't have... The colonel's voice cut through the lobby like a blade. Unhand the man who saved my father's life. Silence fell instantly, heavy and absolute. If this moment gave you chills, subscribe for stories that honor the quietest hero. The colonel walked directly to Calvin and saluted him again, this time holding the position until Calvin, somewhat dazed, returned it once more. Sir, I owe you my entire existence, the colonel said, voice carrying clearly through the now silent lobby. My father told me about you every birthday, every Christmas, every time I put on this uniform. Calvin blinked eyes, searching the younger man's face for familiar features. Your father, Corporal James Reeves, November 1968. You dragged him 3 miles under enemy fire after both his legs were hit. He lived long enough to have me because of you. Recognition dawned in Calvin's eyes. Jimmy, little Jimmy. Reeves, his son, Sir Colonel Robert Reeves now. He gestured to the photo in Calvin's hand. My father is in that picture, isn't he? Calvin nodded, tears threatening, but military bearing, holding them at bay. Ferd from the right, always joking, even in the worst time. The room remained frozen as the colonel turned to address the mayor, who had emerged from the ceremony hall to investigate the commotion. Is this how your city welcomes the last surviving hero of the very unit you're claiming to honor today? The mayor stammered something about protocols and security procedures, but the damage was already apparent on the faces of those gathered. Several were recording with their phones. Within minutes, the footage began spreading across social media. Veterans watching online recognized what was happening. Calls were made. Text messages flew by the time Calvin was escorted inside, not by security, but by the honor guard. The colonel had brought a dozen more veterans had arrived, some still in work clothes, others having dropped everything to come stand with a brother they'd never met. The photo Calvin carried was carefully taken by Natalie, who had arranged for it to be displayed on the main podium. Enlarged, the faces of his fallen squad members now looked out over the ceremony hall. The mayor offered a public apology, words carefully chosen to minimize political damage. Calvin simply shook his head. I'm not here for speeches or apologies. I came to remember my men, to see their name on a building so people might ask who they were. Natalie handed him the microphone that had been intended for the mayor's speech. Calvin looked at it uncertainly, then at the gathered crowd. He simply read 7 names. No dramatic storytelling, no self-promotion, just the truth of men who had given everything. A Vietnam veteran in the audience stood when Calvin finished. Then another. Within moments, every veteran present from all eras, all branches stood in silent respect. The guards who had removed Calvin were nowhere to be seen, quietly dismissed by their supervisor, who had watched the entire scene unfold with growing horror. Colonel Reeves stepped forward again. Sergeant Brooks was recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross in 1968. Somehow paperwork was lost. Somehow his name was forgotten, but not by those who matter. He produced a blue case from his aide, opening it to reveal the medal inside. The Secretary of the Army has reviewed and approved the original recommendation. It's 50 years late, but it's yours. Calvin looked at the medal, then at the enlarged photo of his squad. It belongs to them too. The ceremony continued, but not as planned. The building was still dedicated to the 17th, but now with authentic testimony from a man who had lived its history, rather than politicians who had merely read about it. Natalie stayed near Calvin, making sure he had water, that he was comfortable, that no one overwhelmed him with questions. She saw in him her grandfather, another quiet man who had carried war's weight without complaint. When the formal proceedings ended, Calvin found himself surrounded by people eager to shake his hand, to thank him, to take photos with a man they had overlooked just hours earlier. I don't understand, he told Colonel Reeves quietly. I'm the same person I was this morning. Nothing's changed. The colonel smiled sadly. Everything's changed, sir, just not you. The security company's regional director approached, visibly uncomfortable. Miss Brooks, on behalf of our entire organization, I want to extend our deepest. Calvin raised a hand, stopping him. Young man, I don't need apologies. Just make sure your people look at old men's eyes, not just their clothes. By evening, Calvin Brooks's name had become a hashtag, a symbol for how easily society forgets its quietest hero. That night, after the formal ceremony concluded, the building held an impromptu candlelight vigil in honor of the forgotten members of the 17th. Veterans from across 3 generations stood shoulder to shoulder, many in civilian clothes, united by an understanding that transcended time. Calvin was offered a permanent seat on the city's Veterans Advisory Board, a position he accepted, not for himself but for the opportunity to ensure other veterans wouldn't be forgotten. Local schools reached out asking if he would speak to students about his experience. Calvin agreed on one condition, that the focus remain on his squad members, not himself. The security company implemented new training protocols using Calvin's experience as a case study in both their failures and the cost of assumption. The incident became required viewing for all new hires. Natalie Harper was promoted to Veterans Liaison Officer, a position created specifically to prevent similar oversights. Her first project, a comprehensive database of all living veterans in the county, ensuring none would be overlooked again. A simple wooden bench was installed outside the building's main entrance, with a bronze plaque that read, "Reserved for First Sergeant Calvin Brooks, and the men who never came home." The 2 guards who had escorted Calvin out were quietly dismissed, though Calvin himself asked the company to consider reassignment rather than termination. They made a mistake, he told the director. We all do. What matters is learning from it. 1 month after the ceremony, Natalie received a package at her office. Inside was a carefully folded American flag and a handwritten note from Calvin. You were braver than anyone inside that room. You saw what others missed. My squad would have been proud to know you. She displayed it proudly on her desk, a reminder of why her work mattered. As for Colonel Reeves, he made sure Calvin received not only his long overdue Distinguished Service Cross, but also the proper medical benefits that had been lost in bureaucratic errors decades earlier. The colonel visited monthly, sometimes bringing his children to meet the man who made our family possible. Calvin still visits the Riverside Memorial Building once a year on the anniversary of the day his squad was lost. He brings fresh flowers for the memorial plaque that now includes all 7 names and photographs. He never asked for attention, never needs to, because now every time he enters the entire staff stands, not because of protocols or obligations, but because respect once truly given becomes impossible to withdraw. In a world obsessed with noise and recognition, Calvin Brooks taught an entire community that some heroes speak loudest in silence, that honor isn't found in ceremonies or medals, but in the quiet dignity of those who serve without expectation of return. That the greatest strength isn't in forcing others to see you, but in seeing others when no one else will. Subscribe to Steelheart Stories if you believe some salutes carry the weight of generations.